Okay, I've just got word that you are live on air, so good evening everyone. It's absolutely great that you are joining us from behind your computer screens on this summery evening. So a very warm welcome to this third lecture in the Jokerweek lecture series. As you might have noticed, this year's edition of the Jokerweek is special for several reasons. To my mind, the most important one is not that it is the first digital edition, but rather that it is the first experiment in a student-led organization, a week in which students can put their own interests central. After a long preparation and after numerous ventures into other themes and topics that were broadly categorized under architecture and activism, the Jokerweek group forwarded shifting positions as the most urgent matter. During the week, we will investigate the diversity of roles architects can take up in a changing society. Our society is facing numerous challenges today, ranging from the smallest of scales to the most wicked of problems. And it is great to see how our students are trying to look for ways in which the architectural discipline can stay relevant by shifting position in a society in constant flux. The work of Applied Foreign Affairs fits this bill extremely well. After all, the condition of flux is, according to architectural historian and critic Hannah Leroux, at the heart of their practice. First, through their interest in constantly changing conditions, an interest that is visible in the working terrain of applied foreign affairs. Working mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, it are precisely the conditions of constant change related to the shifting migration patterns that are so inherent to these regions that are of interest to the group. And second, constant change also defines the very identity of applied foreign affairs. As a research laboratory embedded in the Institute of Architecture at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, the team, consisting mainly of students, constantly changes. This shifting setting, incorporating students from a variety of disciplines, not only allows for a real transdisciplinary approach to the questions raised, it also constantly pushes the boundaries of what an architectural research lab can be. While such a description of a European university studio working in the context of the Global South immediately raises important critical questions of positionality, the approach of Applied Foreign Affairs largely succeeds to transcend such critiques. By constantly reflecting on how to deal with a specific question or a specific design brief, the practice abandons any general preconceptions of building in Africa, be it in the development of a dynamic growth plan for the village of Guabuliga in the north of Ghana, in the analysis of water in the city of Kisangani in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or in their more recent research into the spatial realities of people on the move. The practice succeeds in leaving more neo-colonial approaches to building in the tropics behind. In a welcome moment of relief, Applied Foreign Affairs shows us how a contemporary Western practice working in Africa and the Middle East can do relevant work, easily going beyond all those so-called adapted building strategies for these regions that are so widely celebrated now in Western architectural milieux.
It is an honor to host Baerbel Mueller, the founder and driving force behind Applied Foreign Affairs. Apart from her work in the Applied Foreign Affairs Lab at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, she also directs her own architectural research office based in Ghana and Austria under the enigmatic acronym NAV_S, which is, if I have to believe some random websites, short for Navigations in the Field of Architecture and Urban Research within Diverse Cultural Contexts. After the lecture, we will have a roundtable discussion between Baerbel, Robbie Vivier, Guust Hamerling, Johan Lara, and me. And afterwards, we'd be happy to look at the questions in the chat room. So, take the mic, I would say.
Baerbel, the floor is yours.
Okay,
if you're all set.
Thank you for this kind introduction. So I will not introduce myself again. Good evening, everyone, and I'm excited and honored to be part of your project week on shifting positions, and grateful to Johan for this invitation and the team around him. So for tonight, and in response to the topic or question of shifting positions in architecture, I decided to not structure my presentation as one lecture, but more as a collection of fragments with different foci thoughts and questions. In between, I will briefly introduce 4 selected projects, and I hope for an interesting conversation and vivid discussion afterwards. Applied Foreign Affairs. Applied Foreign Affairs is a lab that investigates spatial, infrastructural, environmental, and cultural phenomena in rural and urban sub-Saharan Africa, and of recent also in the Middle East. Projects are based on an interdisciplinary, transcultural, and experimental approach, and students are introduced to the spatial diversity and cultural vibrancy of contemporary African conditions, followed by workshops which focus on the status and potential of a specific place or situation. Each lab project centers on a distinct question and clear mission, and culminates in field trips or residencies through which rural growth patterns, prototypes, imaginary art spaces, and relational physical interventions are produced. Some projects are conceptualized as pure artistic research, others are based on a design task or commission, and some combine both. Conventional relationships between client, community, and architect, teacher and student and NGO, studio, university, and field are questioned. The process of relating and making is conceptualized in a reactive and slowed down manner. Conditions of uncertainty and fragility are embraced. At best, spatial and programmatic hybrids of diverse ownerships emerge. A laboratory is per definition a facility that provides conditions in which research and experiments in a field of study may be performed, a place for testing, observing, and practicing. This is done in an applied manner, as AFA's name and the logic of a lab implies. A purely academic, projective, and digital environment is what is left behind. From the very beginning of a new project, students are sent out to investigate, to test out on a one-to-one scale, and to encounter spatial situations in the world outside of university. Whenever possible, an experimental and playful approach is created and upheld throughout the entire process of a project, allowing for an open-ended experience with not too many constraints. Given project briefs are intensely interrogated and reflected upon, often reduced or shifted into other directions. This might happen on a conceptual level or a programmatic one, or is just manifested in a change of scale. To a certain extent, the respective project partner needs to be involved in this process, and invented projects followed their own logic and are translated as artistic research, temporary interventions, or events. Here, the starting point are self-defined topics which cover a research interest of either AFA or that of an individual in the team. On this more recent organigram, you see the different subcategories in which I structure AFA currently, which is basically 3 topical foci, which are ecologies, post-conflict, ecopunctures, and performing urban. To the right side, you see a list of the most of the projects which we have been working on in Ghana, the DRC, Lagos and Conakry, Erbil in Kurdish Iraq, and Damascus in Syria. So I will jump in like the first project I want to very briefly show to you, which was the shortest and least complex we ever did. So based on an invitation by a theater festival in Conakry and collaborators in France who are scenographers by professional background, we were invited to jointly work on a theater festival in 2019 in Conakry with the shared interest in working based on the idea of urban ecopuncture. So it was not meant to be a festival being placed in institutional spaces, but distributed throughout the city. And what you see here is like how we started this lab, like on the one hand doing some research back in Vienna, then on the other hand inviting the festival director Hakim Ba to Vienna. And what you see to the bottom left was like research done, like what I call desk research done in Vienna, like having been informed by potential locations for spatial interventions, students would look at potential interventions. And what you see to the bottom right is like what I like a lot to do is not starting applied research in the respective project context, but already in Vienna. And that was a 3-hour task I assigned, which was like each student was equipped with a square meter of foil and asked to position it in public space, whereby this one student went into one of their important museums in Vienna. Arriving in Conakry, we only had 2 weeks to come up with an installative work which would be a kind of ad hoc staging in Conakry's neighborhoods in Congo, Kipi, and Kapo, and the project was labeled Portique and evolved in the course of 10 days basically. So it was a lightweight structure made from metal and textile strings, which framed the entrances of the theater spaces of the festival. The installative piece emphasized the threshold between two spatial conditions, the street and the compound, inside and outside, semi-private and public, formal and informal. It aimed to generate a transgression between the selected locations of the festival and the surrounding city, between the world of theater and the rhythm of the dynamics of daily life. And like what I did here is like basically collaging 3 venues which we somehow appropriated with this piece. And as I said, that was the work of 2 weeks. What I'm also always interested in, like looking at what we have been doing in a certain location, and in the course of the interests of this spatial intervening in Conakry, we came up with this idea to have a panel or symposium in Vienna afterwards. And that what you see here was like this moment in September when we were allowed to physically work at university, again looking at the material we produced in Conakry and trying to translate this textile temporary intervention into one of the spaces at our institute, which will culminate in a panel which needed to be postponed several times already because of COVID. And this is a page of our magazine which will also somehow embed the work in a larger context on the notion of context and how to intervene in urban environments. We usually speak about the conception and realization of projects, which is more related to the what question, but obviously the specific what and the how are interdependent. For this event and tonight, I think it's more relevant to focus on the how, the method, and strategies. Also on the how in the sense of how to position oneself. How to position oneself towards a given project brief in a given or self-chosen context in the field of architecture, in architectural education, and in the world. If I would be asked to wrap up the how in one sentence or statement, I would say that most crucial in my practice and teaching is that it's rather about questioning than stating. which might be obvious in academia and research work, but is not so common in practicing architecture, which I think is highly problematic. And that might be the reason why I prefer collaborating with artists instead of architects mostly. To come up with other forms of knowledge production, research methods, concepts, artistic translations, designs, and implementations, it's crucial to be open and receptive. To generate alternative, speculative, and other spaces and environments which can respond to the challenges of our time, we cannot just repeat what we know or what is out there, or express our own creativity only, but we need to seriously question what is needed and how we can find answers to pressing topics from within our professional background as spatial experts. In 2015, I was asked to give a statement on how design and design education will ideally evolve over the next 10 years. And now, 6 years later, I still would wish for my optimistic statement to come true. In 2025, we will have finally understood that our planet has limited resources. All designers will work and act and educate simultaneously with a truly planetary and truly local approach, and in truly transcultural and truly transdisciplinary settings. It will be about beauty and ego, not ego. Besides the how, there is always also the question of the why, which is mostly the deepest and which one doesn't ask oneself on a daily basis. I believe in the relevance of architecture and the power and potential of spatial manifestations, and first and foremost the capacity and responsibility of architects and spatial practitioners to create a surplus. The claim to create a surplus is also the driving motive when working in extreme project environments and in transcultural collaborations. I think there is little legitimization if we operate in these settings to gain our own experience only or widen our personal horizon. And when I talk about creating a surplus and about responsibility, I don't mean it in a moral sense. There is a lot of playfulness in AFA's approach, as you have seen already in the first project presentation. But we also need to critically reflect on what we do or did in asking ourselves, what have we been doing, how, why, where, and what would we do differently next time? So I will show you a lot of slides now from a recent implementation project in the village of Guabuliga in northern Ghana. What was mentioned in the introduction already is like a previous project which was titled Guabuliga Well by the Thorntree, which was an investigation on this village on planning scale and also like strategies for further village growth. And like I don't know, 7 years later, we were asked, or let's say commissioned to design a market in Guabuliga. And I would like to run through these images now to show you like how a project is developed in the lab. Okay, so what you, so what you see here is like the market as it looks like now. And this is like in an early morning situation where there is no active market life. This is a drone shot to better understand how it's positioned in its context. What you see here is the work I talked about, which we have been doing in 2013, which was a growth proposal for Guabuliga, where we emphasized a lot on open and green spaces, and the work was based on considering the seasonal changes in a farming community. And one of the outcomes was the implementation of a green belt, as we learned that people know how to build their houses, and that there would be more urgency in coming up with an open space policy. And the market project evolved from this tragedy of thinking in modular geometry and like based on the idea of potential growth. So this is like how the market looks like now when there is market days. And the whole design process was like intensely focused on the behavior of sellers and buyers on markets in Ghana. So how I started the lab was like I asked the project team to buy a kilogram of oranges on markets in Vienna and in Poland and in all the places the students have been at that respective Christmas break, and to notate this interaction. And what you see here is like applied research in Ghana, like on the top left, you see a drawing which was an investigation in the big market in Kumasi in Ghana. And below again, like these tasks of transactions to buy certain commodities and notate this interaction. And so looking on markets before landing, so to say, in Globaliga. And here there had been intense discussions with the authorities in the village. Then also like interviews and interactions with market women in the village. Then also like looking carefully at the context and questioning the current or at that time current position of the empty marketplace and relocating the site. And again, testing this in a one-to-one manner by positioning tables to simulate potential selling conditions. Then inviting the community to participate in these one-to-one outlinings. Then back in Vienna, inviting the client, which has been authorities in the village and an Austrian NGO. Thinking and researching on the notion of materiality, then also like changing the design according to budgets and the need to simplify. Doing that was like then the real work on the engineering part and detailing. Going back to Ghana to again share the latest design with the village chief, starting with foundation works and doing a realization project, which was not a design build, but it was like that young men in the community were engaged to work on site. And then also there had been work with welding workshops in Tamale, which is about 100 kilometers distance, where there had been the facilities to work with steel. So the task of the students, which were only 3 at the end, was to supervise professionals. And that then was translocated to Globaliga. I think I need to speed up to not go too much into detail. Here you see the primary structure set up in a rainy season situation, and then also building the furniture. And like the idea in the design was also to leave space for the villages and market people to inhabit this surface by themselves. Then, which was really beautiful to see, there had been a lot of interest in getting a place in the market. Therefore, we were asked to extend the market, and there was not a budget to continue with floorscapes and roofscapes, and therefore we came up with this idea of a more informal open surface with these poles where people could hang their commodities and freely appropriate the surface. And that's basically how the market looks like. Yes. So as you have seen, the process is quite crucial in these projects. So in terms of how I would summarize my approach to architecture and spatial practices, most strikingly, I would say that to me, architecture is more a verb than a noun. This implies an aspiration to shift focus from the product to the process. I'm always as interested in the process as in the result, which of course, after implementation, translates into an interest in the ongoing life of a completed project, whereby I would hardly ever define a project as completed, which again is provoking long-term engagements. Another project which you might know from the Applied Foreign Affairs publication is like the Hadua Apartheid at Ghana's coast, which was designed and implemented in 2013 and 2014. Located between the fishing town Apam and the fishing village Apricum in Ghana's central region. And what was really important to me here was like that the original commission or request was to come up with a master plan for a future institution of performing arts. And I felt that this is a wrong approach and could lead into another white elephant project. Therefore, I was interested in working in a transdisciplinary manner with students of performing arts from Legon University in Accra. And the idea was to exactly start the opposite, like not from a master plan, but from the performing body. Therefore, here you see the location again, and that's how the final stage design looked like. And yes, here is like what I wanted to start from is like, so the idea was to start from the human body and not only involving students or young performers, but also asking the architects back in Vienna already to start from this performative approach. And then we continued as a transdisciplinary, transcultural team in Apam on site, outlining stages and then looking at the conditions on site and so defining design parameters based on these one-to-one body exercises and outlining exercises. And what you see here to the left is like a stage on campus in Accra, and we took these dimensions and basically outlined all over the site a stage in same proportion to look at acoustics and visual connections and like environmental parameters. We then wrapped up this initial research in a ad hoc exhibition in Accra. And now I think I focus a bit on the design itself. Based on these performative exercises, there was the question how a theater space or a performing space could look like in a Ghanaian rural context by not somehow copying the Western model of the theater space. So we looked at performative events in Ghanaian culture, but also at Kiesler's Raumbühne. And that was then translated into a design of a floorscape and a roofscape, whereby I always interpret now that the floorscape was heavily informed by cultural parameters and the roofscape by environmental parameters. So this project was developed by physical models, but also one-to-one tests before we left a second time to Ghana for the realization of this project. Testing bamboo. And here, that was like me being in Ghana before the team arrived, looking at the harvest of bamboo, which was then treated on site. Then this was another exhibition of work in progress in between, and then the construction phase started, which started with presenting the project to local authorities and preparing the site with foundation works, which were supervised by one alumni who had been in the team beforehand. Continuing with like to the bottom left and also left side, you see Jörg Stamm, who is a bamboo expert, whom we invited for a 7-day workshop to give us insights into detailing with bamboo. In opposite to the market which I presented beforehand, this was still more like a design build approach. I mean, it was this transdisciplinary performative starting point, but then it was basically students building with local unskilled labor the project from A to Z. I don't do that anymore. But at that time, it was the only possibility. Yes, so I rush a bit through this process of construction now. I also like, as mentioned in the introduction, I not only bring students of architecture, but also students of other professions. And there was a student of social design who was collecting stories in the community. And then she collaborated with the Ghanaian artist Serge Atokwai-Clottey and his collective, who would read out these stories in Apam town and do processions towards the site. So already during the construction phase, it was important to me to somehow connect the community and also the artists to this process of realization. We also involved textile designers, and that was like one student of textile design, also from Angewandte in Vienna, working with a lady from the next fishing town. And that was then a transdisciplinary workshop in Vienna between the students of architecture and the students of textile design to come up with a solution for the membrane of this primary bamboo structure. And yes, playing around with vernacular materials and waste products. Later, we decided for a more technical solution due to the fact that bamboo needs to be protected from the sun and rain. So it was not only one-to-one and testing, but obviously also a design process in the computer. Here you see that like people from the neighboring community were involved to, for example, produce bamboo nails. And so it was a very intensive process of producing 41 bamboo arches, which were then assembled with all kinds of simple means. Maybe I should mention here that like the guy you see on the rooftop was one of the students who had an education as a trained carpenter before studying architecture, which was really crucial in this project. This was a kind of opening for local authorities when this primary structure was almost completed. And then this was like working towards the covering of the structure with the membrane. So that is basically how this stage looked like. When it was completed, then there was the idea to continue with windbreaking elements, which led to another situation where we felt it would be good to involve students of the neighboring community, and this was a workshop on kites to look at the wind conditions again in an applied, playful manner. To then come up with windbreaking elements. And that is like how the space was used in the first years. Actually, I've been on site some weeks ago in Ghana, and the structure is aging, but the primary structure is still fully intact. The membrane is a bit like not as wide as it was before, and would require some maintenance. And what you see here is like that was like looking into the future, working on a zoning plan, and also then, like as I said, starting from the body space to like realizing this core element of a performing arts institution, which is a stage to a master plan, instead of doing it the other way around. But unfortunately, like this never has been realized to the lack of funds. And these are other performance situations. So the notion of context is very crucial in the work of applied foreign affairs. I'm passionate about the truly contextual approaches in architecture and spatial intervening, especially in challenging project environments. Context is the most relevant and beautiful parameter and backbone we have. The concept of context can serve and inspire us from the pragmatic to the poetic and beyond. Thereby, the challenge is to come up with meaningful and visionary translations and hybridizations of what is already there as a given context into contemporary responses and/or spatial manifestations. I would even say that the lack of any deeper understanding and respecting of context causes most of the global as well as very local problems we are currently facing everywhere. Responding to the environmental context has a certain logic and tradition in both vernacular and planned architecture. What is too often lacking is the consideration of the sociocultural context in which a project is located. Quoting Leslie Loco from back in 2013, it's about climate, light, temperature, and form, but it's also about language, meaning, ritual, and space. Cultural contextualism demands profound investigations into understanding the respective sociocultural environment of or cultural ecology of a project, spatially, programmatically, maybe spiritually, and its temporalities. And by giving roots and history a placement, a certain level of abstraction is needed in order to not fall into the trap of romanticism or conservatism. These insights then ought to be followed by essential creative translation when it comes to a new project or next intervention. If one claims to refer to a given context deeply, critically, and innovatively. Mostly artists are better at that. Architects tend to come up with projections and interventions fast, before taking time to just perceive and reflect on what is already there. This is especially problematic when coming from outside and in the context of the African continent and the non-Western world. Working in places such as Globaliga implies the necessity of working in a reactive and slowed down manner. It is very much about time and presence and continuity. Thereby one's own presence need to correspond with the given rhythms of daily life, the local culture and available resources. As architects and researchers, we are always coming from outside and we are always operating within a tight time frame, which has potential but is also very limiting. Hardly ever do we speak or operate from within or over extensive periods of time, even more so when coming from afar. Therefore, we always need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to plan and design from and for a specific territory? How to address spatial questions, environmental topics, and social challenges, privileging the idea that change and development should occur internally. So I will shortly introduce you to our latest lab, which took place this February in Ghana, which falls in the category of urban ecologies. So we have been working in Tamale before, like as you've seen before, like in welding workshops. We've been traveling through Tamale, and we felt that this is a very interesting urban context to be investigated, being one of the fastest growing cities of West Africa, not being a tropical city, neither being a Sahelian kind of urban agglomeration, but something in between. And we were interested in looking at the internal urban peripheries or ecologies of Tamale, and we assigned, so we selected a team of 5 students, and so what you see here was an investigation by me and my colleagues back in November, looking at these inner urban green spaces in Tamale. That was like at the very end of a rainy season, so it looked quite different now in February. And focusing on one of these territories for the lab, we selected 5 students of architecture in Vienna, and we assigned basically 5 topics to investigate, which were ecologies, peripheries, territories, scales, and crises. In February now, we started the lab by collaborating with the SCCA, the Center of Contemporary Art, founded by the artist Ibrahim Mahama, which you see in this photo to the very left. So the idea was like that the 5 students coming from Vienna would collaborate with 5 selected young people in Tamale who spoke or speak the local language. And there was Agatha and her partner looking at ecologies and also like investigating these definitions of first, second, and third nature, which comes from Anat Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World. Then we had Carmen and Abdul Haq looking at the notion of territories by territorial claims of plants, animals, and human beings. Then Anna Maria, she was interested in the definition of the notion of peripheries and looking at the edge situation of this given terrain. Georgios, he struggled in the definition of crisis and looking at certain types of crisis at this given site, but also beforehand heavily investigating how we can define crisis at this moment in time. And Daniel, who was assigned the topic of scales, but not in the classical sense how we usually look at scale, but he was more interested in hyperobjects and therefore identified water as an hyperobject which plays a crucial role in this very specific open territory or terrain in Tamale. And so we luckily managed to travel to Ghana and collaborate with SCCA. And like what we always do at the end of these labs is like sharing our work. And that was happening at the last day of the lab in one of these abandoned structures in the location itself, coming up with this ad hoc exhibition, which attracted lots of people, including the owners of these urban farms. So besides the farmers, there had been students from the University of Development Studies and also our collaborators from SCCA. Besides the notion of context, I think the idea of unlearning is crucial in our work. To come up with another body of knowledge, new approaches and alternative solutions, one needs to engage oneself with the unknown. And one needs to leave one's own comfort zone. This refers to the work and professional contribution itself, as well as the encounter with a not yet familiar context, which is basically the case in every single project we do as architects. To achieve this, applied foreign affairs educational agenda is conceptualized as an alternating process of unlearning and learning. A kind of reset is needed to explore alternative, critical ways of knowledge production, other spatial practices, and new prospects for collaboration. So I will leave it here and hope for an interesting discussion with you. Thank you. So I
Baerbel, you can
stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Do you
We
see
see
me
you
now?
Yes.
Okay.
And do you see us?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So we can open the discussion. Who wants to go first?
I had quite a burning question, actually, that was already on my mind when I was reading through your work earlier, Baerbel. But first, let me thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was very clear, despite having uncertainty as a sort of keyword in your own practice. It was a very clear presentation. So my question would be why that applied foreign affairs has such a non-European focus. Because it seems to me that this approach of unlearning or context or all these fascinating things you talked about do not really seem exclusively applicable to the non-Wests. So could you say that, for example, the next project of applied foreign affairs could be, for instance, in Belgium, or is that unthinkable? Or could it become a sort of applied home affairs even at some stage? I'm just speculating here.
Oh yes, it's a very interesting question, and that was a bit also my background that I came to Ghana. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There was just a police car passing by.
Okay. It was my situation that I went to Ghana first time as a student of architecture, and at that time it was a collaboration with Kumasi University, and at that time it was all about the idea on how we work on public open spaces in the context of European cities, and I learned a lot from it in Kumasi, and that was of course transferable to the idea of public and open spaces in a European context. And I would say, like in the case of applied foreign affairs, it's more like biographical and my interest, but I think it's of course something which is applicable everywhere, and so this focus on Ghana is more based off like my idea that I think it's as I said, it's critical to understand the context, and therefore I feel more comfortable in like working in a context which I'm familiar in, which obviously would also be Vienna. But yeah, sure, it could be applied home affairs, yeah.
Sarah, you want to go or?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I was wondering, I was thinking while listening to your lecture that it must be fun to be a student that works on these projects. But I was also thinking, why are all these students from Vienna, and on the basis of what do they get selected? Are these students very good designers? Are these students people who read and write a lot? And yeah, maybe it goes a little bit far, but why would you not invest, for example, in diaspora from Ghana or Ghanese students? Am I clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, like if I would talk about this recent team in which I brought to Tamale, it's a Russian student, a Moldavian student. It was a Chinese student who needed to step back, German, a Polish, and an Austrian. And in the case of Globaliga, it was an Indian student, a Taiwanese student, a Latvian student. So it's like our institute is very international, and therefore the student body is international. And I always really try to make sure that there is students who are not from a purely European background, but let's say diasporan Ghanaian or West African students, we don't have any at our institute, and that might also be a bit of a difference between Belgium and Austria, that I think you have another kind of student body. You have a Congolese community in Brussels, and so that's not the case in Vienna. So I try the maximum if it comes to like being from all parts of the world. What I didn't present is like for maybe that's interesting to talk about for a while, and that was like back in the time when we've been working on the hardware project. I felt it's more interesting to work with Ghanaian students who are from another professional background. And much later, which was like 2 years ago, it was first time that I felt ready to also have an open call at Kumasi University and also like the other school of architecture in Accra, where we did research on a neighborhood in Accra where 5 students from Vienna would collaborate with 5 students of architecture from like in the Ghanaian context. And so it was mostly artists and it was mostly in the respective project environment. Of course, it would be fantastic to bring students from a West African context to Vienna, but as our sites are located there, it was not a necessity so far, besides the fact that it would be quite difficult visa-wise, etc. Yeah. Or logistically, yeah.
Barbara,
Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I would like to pick up on the question of Fizara, because what I very much like in your work, Barbara, is you're very flexible about your own positionality. You have this idea that we need slowness, and that slowness is like really crucial. But my question is, you've read a lot. You have this kind of enormous knowledge and the kind of, you've read the stuff that really helps you to like situate yourself and be very precise in how you think about your positionality. But how do you prepare students? What kind of time do you need to basically let students understand what it means to work in a context like that? Do you have them read certain things? What is like the preparatory phase of something like this? Do you jump immediately into the design, or is this like kind of let's get the context right first? So how does that work? How do you do that? And what kind of time do you need to do that?
Yes. maybe I also missed a bit of the previous question, which was like which kind of students I select, and that also relates to like the diversity of tasks we take or define ourselves, which go from urban scale to design, and then it's on ecologies or it's performative interest and artistic research. So the selection of students also heavily relies on the like how I start is like that there is students in the institute. There is an open call, and then there is, let's say, an urban environment such as Lagos, and then I would look at portfolios and we have a discussion, and then someone who ends up designing a market in Globaliga is a very different student than someone I would select to look at the notion of or the idea of terra vague in the middle of Lagos. So that's like regarding the selection of students, and how I prepare students is like, and that was maybe not so present in the slideshow, unfortunately, like that we would, there is a lot of reading on post-colonial discourse. Of course, I try to create an awareness on what it means to be a white person going to West Africa. Then also like what it means to be white and male and European. So there is readings, but mostly then already somehow related to the topical focus.
Okay.
And this what I like how I ended with the unlearning. I really mean it on all levels, like that. And therefore, like if you ask us, or like what you've seen in already back in the Hadua project, for example, that I invited a performer in Vienna to work to have this 3-day workshop on like the body space with students of architecture, which creates a first irritation and shock, almost like that you are asked to perform and dance and go into the city and do a performative intervention being a student of architecture. And then that continues then also in Ghana, because there's obviously a lot of funny ideas on the African context, especially also then in a context like Vienna, where there is little background on that. Yeah.
Chris, do you want to?
I maybe have a specific question, and it's also about including the locals to your architectural practice, and that is about your newest book, Structures of Displacement. And therein you talk about the process of designing the new agricultural training center at the Harsham camp. And there you said you like to add a hammam to the camp, because the women they don't have any place to undress or unveil themselves comfortably because the camp doesn't allow that. So you want to create a kind of gendered space where the kind of safe space where the women feel safe. And I think I missed some nuance on that, because I was wondering to what extent you talked about that with the locals from the camp and with the inhabitants. I think I missed that because I only went briefly through the newest book. So I was wondering to what extent you involve the locals and inhabitants of that place.
So I consciously didn't speak about structures of displacement in this project because it was a bit of a different project setup. So it was like that UNIDO is a UN organization, and so I'm very critical about the development sector. And basically the NGO I work with for the last 10 years in Globaliga is the only NGO I work with. And then there was this time where I focused solely on collaborating with artists. But the downside with that is like that there's hardly any budgets. And then there was this invitation by UN organization UNIDO in 2016 to collaborate in West Africa, and or even a bit earlier. And then they focused on the Middle East and the so-called refugee crisis. And I wanted to take students to Erbil already back then, and I was really warned by my university told me I cannot do that, like being 70 kilometers away from Mosul and the battle zone. So I decided for another project setup, which was like involving AFA alumni and like Stephanie Teuritzbacher, who became the project architect for this agricultural center. She was one of my students and she lives in Lagos now, and I knew that she would be the right person to somehow be on her own in Erbil to go through this realization process. What we did, so it was on the one hand it turned out to be a very constrained project, because UN organization has all these constraints and there is contracts and everything. But beforehand, it was a very open invitation, and there was also a long desk research phase where a student of architecture who is from Erbil and Kurdish Iraqi, she was heavily involved in this desk research, and it was very clear also through a wider research that especially women in these camp settings suffer from having really a very hard living conditions, and also not having the chance to leave the camps, in opposite to their husbands who would try to find work outside. So there was a lot of communication about this hammam part of the program, which was later eliminated from the UNIDO side, which I still regret, because I think that was the most crucial part of that. Yeah.
Right.
Could I pick up again on the question, because I think it's something which is you said it in your lecture also. You're very much interested in developing projects where there are hybrids of ownership possible, so that people basically can claim ownership of the project. So could you elaborate a bit? I mean, I recognize that very much in some of the projects you did in Africa. Do you feel that you found a way and method of doing that, or is it like every time a struggle, and you think it's really possible?
I think it's really possible, but I think it's in every project it's very, very different. And if I continue shortly talking about this camp environment in Erbil, Iraq. So the Harsham camp is an IDP, like a camp of internally displaced people. And there was the idea from UNIDO side that we come up with a prototypical solution, which is temporary. And part of the most interesting part of the desk research or the discourse in this project to me was like the notion of temporality and permanence. And so we felt like if something like a hammam, which would ideally have been built with rammed earth, is something which is stable and unique and has a certain level of permanence, but being made from rammed earth, it's also something which can easily decay and fall apart or be destroyed if necessary. Then so it was the idea of identification and of creating another space, and which would allow the women to claim ownership in this very fragile and temporary living condition. If it comes to ownership in the case of the first planning scale, how should I call it? I mean, in Guabolika, we are working there for 10 years now. And like at the time when we came up with the growth proposal and this Greenbelt project, that was a project which was then somehow monitored by one of the students who was a student of landscape architecture from another university in Vienna and who did his PhD on that project. And therefore, he would really come back and look at like if the maintenance of these trees would work or not. And it was quite difficult. So something like maintenance. So there is ownership, but there is no maintenance in the context of a village in northern Ghana, and so I would say it's very different in each project.
And I think the maintenance aspect is really, for me, crucial, because I mean, what's the afterlife of these projects, and who has then agency to? I mean, I've had the same discussion with Hannah Leroux, who did this very beautiful project in Guatemala with the students, and I mean, in a couple of years, people basically, so it worked fine for like 2-3 years, and then it basically got lost. So the question is also, how does that make you feel as a project designer? I mean, can you let go, or how do you deal with that? I mean,
oh, that's a very difficult question, but the question then is also like, like in the case of Guabolika, it's really ongoing, and it's clear to every person involved. I have ongoing projects there, so it's more like a lifetime relationship. It was also that I have been working as an architect before I brought students in Guabolika. I was made a chief's queen in this village a long time ago, so that's a very special situation. In the case of the Hadua stage, there was also a bit of frustration, like that I came up with this concept of like building the heart of a performing arts institution, which is a stage, and not doing a white elephant project, but this stage turns out to be a bit of a white elephant because there's like the means lacking for this collective of artists to maintain it, like not necessarily the bamboo dome, but the institutional space. So it's different in all these projects. But if you work in a tropical environment, maintenance is crucial. But in other cases, maybe shortly talking about what we did in Lagos, there was an invitation to collaborate with Legacy 1995, which is an interest group being concerned about the built heritage of Lagos. And so they invited us to collaborate in looking at the railway compound in Ebute Meta and looking at the running shed. And it's like the given brief was designing a railway museum, and I was really questioning that, because I thought, okay, if you're a person living in Lagos, there's lack of green space, there's lack of any space to breathe, and if you would go to a railway museum once or twice a year, maybe. And so we collaborated with young Lagos-based artists, and so we were looking at the notion of heritage and scale and terre vague, and looked at the potential of this space as something which is not developed and not planned. And what was really beautiful for me, so that we basically opened up this fantastic space for a public which was coming from the architectural field or art field, and like half a year later, for the first Lagos Biennial, this was like becoming the main venue. And so I think the success of this lab was just like showing that there is a potential for this space to become a non-commercial open space where people could consume art or just be. Yeah.
okay.
You just talked about this bamboo structure, and you also mentioned the rammed earth structure of the hammam or sauna. Materiality is a very important aspect of your work. I have the feeling you also mentioned it in your own quote somewhere about the limited resources of planet Earth, which was a beautiful one. I was wondering, because you, at a certain point, you also mentioned vernacular materials, and I was wondering what a vernacular material would be. Definitely because I think that I saw in one of the photographs you showed that the bamboo structure was tied together with tie wraps. So for me, this image of tie wraps together with bamboo is a sort of captures this tension that is in this notion of the vernacular material. So I was just wondering how you, if you could comment on this.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. So yeah. So I mean, when I talked about context, so I think I'm really interested in looking at a context on a environmental level, but also on this cultural level. And if it comes to this environmental aspect or like climatic conditions, if it's about a design task, it's a lot about the decision is a lot about the materiality. So I think there is a lot of potential in looking at what is available locally, but I'm not one of these hardcore architects who believes like that rammed earth is the solution. And I also think it's a very fine line, because and that was also mentioned in my comment on contextual approaches and like not falling into the trap of like mimicking vernacular, or like also like expressing yourself in learning local techniques and replicating that, because I think and that's something which I mentioned, is like that there is the need to create a surplus. If not, there is no reason to be in an environment like that, because people know how to build with earth. In the case of the bamboo dome, it was really the idea to take a material which is there, which is not used in building scale, but more for fences and furniture, and then to have this low-tech, high-tech hybridization, so to say, like that you have a low-tech material, you bring in your digital skills, and then you come up with translations of something which is in the vernacular context, but not copying that, or because I think it's also a bit patronizing in regards to development. Like I had discussions on conferences like, why didn't you build with thatch roof in the village of Gorbuliga, but metal roofing sheets? And I think that I really almost get upset with this kind of approach, like, because I mean, we are in the 21st century and we all have the right to develop, or you work with materials which are on the market, and we cannot come in with ideas of like the romantic idea of natural materials and vernacular techniques.
Is there another go? Another question? Should we open the floor, perhaps? Baerbel, would it be fine that we take like a 5 to 10 minute break, that we open the floor for questions from the audience, and then we get back to you? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay.
are going to happen to you. And the most important thing to do is to harness your will and let it go and move so you can grow, so you can get on with your life. It doesn't matter about what happens to you. What matters is, what are you going to do about it? Move so you can grow.
Okay, welcome back. So what we're going to do now is there are some questions coming in to the chat. Please continue to pose your questions for Baerbel, and I will read them to Baerbel so that she can answer these questions. Frédéric Razier asks what the time frame is in which these projects are coming to a result. And maybe more important, how the project definition is starting and what are the triggers to start such a process. And he asked this question because in his sense, there is a strong relation towards his own practice in Belgium about initiating projects together with partners, all kinds of sorts.
Okay, this is quite interesting. First, I think I focus on the time frame. Like the first project I showed was the Conakry play Urban, which was like the shortest ever, which would be like being for 2 weeks in Conakry and solely focusing on what the theater people and the scenographers would have done before. But it was like being in Conakry in November, and the team was formed in April, and then Hakim Ba would come from Paris to Vienna in April, and then Jean-Christophe Lantin would come from Paris in September. And so there is preparation, and that also like implies reading, and like in that case it was the idea of urban acupuncture, the notion of performance, but also trying to get in touch with these theater people beforehand to understand what directors would do. So, but nevertheless, this was the shortest, and the longest is Guabuliga, which is spanning a time frame of 10 years. And the definition, I mean, the whole thing is very open, very experimental, and it's really also, which doesn't come across maybe in these slideshows, that students really struggle, because it's also an unlearning from their studio work, like where you are trained, even if it's quite innovative. But if you're in a studio at our institute, you're basically going through a classical way of developing a design project, and then you're brought to a very different context, and you're asked to perform or to only write, like that. The medium of expression and the topics are very different, and therefore it's this unlearning. And it's also about in some cases, if it's commissions, there is the overall goal is defined, and in other cases it's open-ended, and therefore it's developing through the process, and it's not clear. But that again relates to the time frame, like what you've seen. What we did in Tamale was like this idea to look at this waterworks territory in inner Tamale, and there had been these 5 lenses through which we looked at that. But in parallel, I started a formal collaboration with the University of Development Studies in Tamale, and it's meant to be ongoing. So also it's like that there is these sub topics which then evolve into something bigger over time. I hope I answered the question.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
For me, it was clear, at least. I hope for Frederik as well. So there is another question by Louis de Bethune, and he's wondering if you could expand on your approach to ecology. Would you describe the end result of these exercises as ecological? For example, factoring in ecological costs of flying students there, the short lifespan of some buildings, as you described, and so on. So if you're calculating this in or not.
Okay, so it's more meant in regards to ecologies and economics more than the ecology interest in the Tamale lab, right? Yeah. I think it's an interesting question, and what I mentioned in my lecture is also that with these questions of like, what do we, how, why, where, and then I have these moments in Conakry where I question, like, if it's worth to bring 5 people to play around for 2 weeks and have this temporary structure traveling from A to B to C. And then, but I really think about this, and in the case of the market, for example, there was a team of 6 or 7 students starting the design process and doing the research in Ghana and collaborating in the village. And then when it came to really going into designing details and also implementing, we reduced that team to 3 people because I said it's why should there be 7 students running around in Globaliga if there is unskilled labor and skilled professionals, and it's about supervision, and there was no need to bring more than 3 people. So the ecological aspect is relevant to me, and I also think that what we will take from this COVID year is also other ideas on travel and other possibilities to communicate over distance. Yeah.
So there are, at this point, no more questions of the audience, but I think that there is a question that we could perhaps ask that we, because when we were discussing, one of the things that popped up was the fact that these books seem to have
which we have in the library, so everybody is should consult them. I mean, it's important material, but
that a lot of the work you're doing seems to have a certain audience, which is probably more located in the West than elsewhere.
I think that's the question basically. I mean. You see a very strong attention in your work, also in the presentation, and the neatness of the drawings, the photographic documentation, the exhibits, where you feel, okay, this is probably speaking to one kind of audience. Especially in the first book, you really see this kind of conversation and engagement with local stakeholders. I very much liked the project in the village where you have this kind of really intense discussion with the chief about land and how important land is, and if you do a project that you should actually understand the importance of land and not come in like that. So you feel that very much in that work. So the work and the books that you make, how do they relate to the larger question of this trying to create hybrid forms of ownership and allowing people to basically, to co-create? How do these things, so what are like other things that you also do in order to speak to different audiences, which I think is something that is very much part of the kind of work you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because we discuss that also all the time. And I remember like when we did the AFA book back in 2017, Fausteli Nikula was asking me this question, like, who is the audience? And then my answer was like, everyone. And he said, no, that will not be possible. Like if it comes about, or if we talk about ownership, or let's talk about documentation first. I think in the beginning we completely failed to document, and in opposite to many other labs of this kind. And then or summer schools of all kinds, and then I felt there is a need to carefully document. Then also looking at the aesthetics or graphic of this first book, like one of the first things I told the graphic designers is like, I don't want this Afrika cliche something, and I showed them a book of Sana and said we rather go Japanese style than celebrating like earth and mud, and so there is I think a conscious decision making on what to show and what to not show, and that is a bit conflicting sometimes. And then I would say in this regards it's more for a Western audience because it's this necessity to translate. And that is like that there is a certain kind of photos which I don't show and which I also tell my students are not valid anymore, like this ethnographic or touristic gaze, which is totally excluded. And therefore, like this, there is a kind of like the selection of the visual material, but also this emphasis on a wider discourse is most probably more addressing an audience in academia, let's say. And how I try to share books is like that we always do book launches in the location itself. And also what you've seen with the Tamil territories, for example, that we were really excited that all the farmers Carmen and Abdul Haq had interviewed would come to this event and see what was on the walls. And but I also have these discussions on. We also bring the book as object or artifact back to these environments, but there is a principal question then also like how to continue with like print material or online, like going online and putting all this energy in web formats which are easier to be shared here.
Okay, I think we should come to a close. So we really would like to thank you for sharing your work with us, being very open about the challenges that you meet. What I mean, really admire in your work is that there's on the one hand this kind of discourse of knowledge which is very profound and very reflexive, but that there's also the discourse of action, and that it's, what I really like is the kind of the challenges of doing that and navigating in between those two is what makes your work really exciting. So, and also that you're very explicit about your positionality, which I think is really what this whole week is about. So how do you take your position, and that going into action is meaning that you need to make your hands messy at sometimes, that things fail, that you can't do always what you want, but that there's a, like, I mean, at one point you said architecture has the potential of creating a surplus, which is nice, because I think it's too easy to just stick in the discourse of knowledge and not going. So the question I think we're all struggling with is, where is architecture in all of this? If you think about the urgencies and the societal challenges, should we stop becoming architects? And you made the plea that we shouldn't, that we should create surplus, which is a good message to end with. Okay, so thanks a lot, Baerbel.
Thank you for this invitation. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.